everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Postmodern Realities podcast, brought to you by the Christian Research Institute and the Christian Research Journal. I'm Melanie Cogdill, managing editor of the Christian Research Journal. It's January 2026, and this is episode 482, which is a conversation in our philosopher series about Sigmund Freud. Today's guest is Elisa Riddell, who is a staff writer and associate editor for the online magazine Christ and Pop Culture. She has previously published at Front Porch Republic and Salt and Iron. Elisa has written a feature article for the Christian Research Journal, and her article is called Sigmund Freud and the Making of Our Modern Sexual Identity, and you can read it for free on our website, equip.org. That's EQUIP.org. Elisa, it's good to have you back on the podcast again.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, today, as I noted, we are covering Sigmund Freud, and Elisa has written an article in our ongoing Philosophers series, which has been going on for quite some time now, many years. And so today we're just going to break down Sigmund Freud and his influence on our culture. And so, first of all, I want to note that the article that you wrote, which is quite in-depth, you open it by quoting from Auden and his obituary poem on Freud. And this is what he wrote in that poem. To us, he is no more a person now, but a whole climate of opinion. So that's very fascinating. And so how is Freud, not just a historical figure that everyone kind of knows about? I mean, everybody has heard about him in some context, but how is his work like a climate of opinion that influences culture? He talks about the unconscious. For us, whether we consciously know it or not, like how does Freud's thoughts have really impacted what we think in our culture?
Yeah, Auden's metaphor is so apt. I mean, he says that Freud is like the weather, this all-encompassing climate that affects everybody. And none of us can ignore the weather, whether it's rainy or sunny, whether it's freezing or sweltering, the weather is just a fact that you have to take into account. And Freud's influence on us today, even if we never consciously think about him, even if we know next to nothing about his theories or his work, his influence saturates our cultural assumptions. I've heard it said that anything Freud got right was metabolized by our culture and now seems obvious, so that we don't credit him for those things. But that what he got wrong, the things that were disgusting or absurd or shocking, are the only things that he's remembered for now. And there's some truth to that. But we didn't only absorb a few helpful insights. We took on board some of his bad ideas too. So here are some of the things that are part of this Freudian inheritance. Firstly, the idea that we are not the masters in our own house, that every person has inner conflict and unconscious motivations that lead to self-sabotage and being your own worst enemy, unable to change. It's also this idea that your ego, which is a Freudian term for your conscious self, your ego's kind of hapless and helpless and lacks agency. Another idea that's in the air we breathe is that childhood contains the seeds of adult dysfunction, and that what happens to you in your youth, especially if it's traumatic or shameful, will have this outsized impact on your whole life into adulthood, and that you will probably need professional therapeutic help to become functional. That's a pretty foundational assumption to us today. Another Freudian commonplace is the idea that our inner critic is a sadist, and that what in a prior era people might have called their conscience is seen as entirely negative now. It's this voice that shames you and berates you and tells you you're messing everything up and you'll never amount to anything. And that's what Freud called the superego, this internalized voice of parents and culture that sets impossible moral standards for us. And another Freudian truism is that the realist things about us are not our choices, but our desires, that I'm defined more by what I want than by what I do, and that the real me consists in feelings and drives rather than in responsibilities and duties. And only if it's generated from within does it count as my true self, not if it comes to me from the outside. And lastly, of course, there's this presumption that everything in life comes down to sex. Freud saw sex at the root of all of our problems, and he was incredibly reductive. In the article, I call it the sexualization of everything and expanding the surface area of sex to cover every second of life. And in the Freudian climate of opinion, if you're having problems, then the usual suspects to blame are childhood trauma and sexual repression, which generates shame. And to be clear, I'm not trying to discern at the moment whether all of these assumptions are true. I'm just trying to say that they're Freudian and they're really common. The sociologist Philip Rieff wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic, and he describes 4 different character types that have successively appeared in Western civilization. The first is political man, which is the classical ideal in which a man is devoted to his city. And he's replaced by religious man, which is the Christian ideal of devotion to God. And then religious man is replaced by economic man, which is the liberal Enlightenment ideal of devotion to self-interest and capital. And then finally, he's replaced by psychological man, which is the therapeutic ideal of self-devotion and expressive individualism. And Rieff argues that Freud is foundational to this transition to psychological man. And while it might be tempting to protest and say, I'm not psychological man, I'm religious man because I'm Christian, that's my primary orientation, Rieff isn't talking about your personal beliefs. He's talking about different worlds that afford the emergence of a different kind of human. So for all of us who are Christians today, we are Christians in the world of psychological man. And that changes the way we practice and experience the faith, for better and for worse. And we experience this primarily in the gradual replacement of the language and categories of sin and redemption with that of diagnosis and health. And that creates a lot of complex questions and situations for Christians as we try to articulate, what is wrong with us and as we try to change for the better. And the way we describe and cope with the human condition post-Freud is just different now. And we can't really escape from it in good faith. We have to find a way to work with it shrewdly and carefully. We can't just ignore the psychological perspective because, even if it creates new problems for us, because it's like the weather, it's just there.
Well, about a year ago or so, back in 2025, we published an article, very in-depth article by Elisa that is adjacent to this subject today, and I want to tell our listeners about it. It's called, Is Everybody Traumatized? And Do We All Need Therapy? Because we discuss the current climate now where therapeutic language is kind of what you were saying. It's part of the air that we breathe, and just some of the things that you were just talking about. Most people just would naturally say, oh, I'm affected by my environment or my childhood, and this is why. So I would encourage our listeners, if they haven't already, to listen to that podcast and also to read her article. So now I want to just ask you to back up a little bit and tell us about who Sigmund Freud was. When did he live? And are there any, personal details about his life that will help our listeners understand his particular point of view, why he thought some of the things you just mentioned?
Sure. So Sigmund Freud was born into an Ashkenazi Jewish family in 1856 and lived most of his life in Austria during the Victorian era. He was very intelligent. He was an outstanding student as a boy. He loved literature, and as a child, he dreamed of becoming a poet or a novelist. And as a teenager, his deepest intellectual passion was philosophy, like contemplating big ideas and theories of everything. But his family wasn't wealthy, and they never had quite enough money. So he ended up studying medicine to become a doctor and secure a steady income and professional status. And if you look at his personal letters, he's often preoccupied with 2 things. 1, with gaining financial security, and 2, with securing an impressive professional reputation. So he was curious about the world and intellectually gifted, but that curiosity was always shaped by these goals for social recognition and financial gain. And early in his medical career, he excelled at dissecting organisms and examining them under microscopes, like everything from eels and frogs to human brains. And he could focus intently on one specimen at a time, but even in those early days, a personality trait showed itself. He was not mathematically or empirically inclined. Like one early biographer put it this way, to be tied down to exactitude and precise measurement was not in his nature. And Freud even admitted to a friend in a letter that he lacked mathematical talent and had no memory for numbers or measurements. And this lack of rigor might be low stakes when analyzing dead tissue, but it mattered later when he began clinical work, where more careful data and empirical grounding, where that just matters a lot more when you're dealing with people's lives. And when Freud started working with psychologically suffering patients, his love of grand philosophies and big ideas, combined with his statistical ineptitude and weak attention to detail, it was a bad mix for clinical practice. And as I mentioned earlier, his clear preoccupation with becoming famous for a big discovery and profiting from that renown meant that the incentives were in the wrong places for the practice of sound science. Like his personality, his abilities and interests, his weaknesses, and his priorities all combined in ways that made him susceptible to favoring his theories over messier facts on the ground. So he was both secure and ambitious, working in a field, of medicine for which he didn't have a natural aptitude, not scientifically, not clinically. And Freud lacked compassion for his patients. He couldn't stand the sight of blood. He was easily disgusted by physical disease. And by the time he began practicing psychoanalysis, he was often frustrated with his patients rather than feeling a Hippocratic Oath style moral obligation to their welfare. And he once admitted in a letter that he could, quote, throttle every one of his patients. So for someone with such a mismatch between his desires and how he made a living, it's kind of astounding how influential he became. It's also worth noting that as a young professional, Freud regularly dosed himself with cocaine, which was a relatively new and unknown drug at the time. People knew a lot about morphine addiction in the 1880s, but in the eyes of Freud and others at the time, cocaine wasn't obviously the addictive and destructive substance that we know it is now. And since Freud struggled with a variety of ailments like anxiety and depression, as well as stomach complaints and headaches and stage fright, feelings of inferiority and worries about his sexual prowess, he would take cocaine, and unsurprisingly, he would feel a whole lot better afterwards. He didn't seem to show signs of addictive behavior, like he could kind of take it or leave it and go without it for days at a time. But he definitely showed signs of manic euphoria and inflated grandiosity when he was on it. And sometimes he would stay up all night writing on a cocaine high. And Freud's big idea, for which he's remembered today, is psychoanalysis. He's often called the father of psychoanalysis, which is both a therapeutic method and a theory of mind. In Freud's conception, an analyst helps a patient bring repressed unconscious thoughts, desires, and conflicts into conscious awareness with the aim of triggering a curative catharsis that would relieve neuroses or hysteria. And those are both Victorian era terms for what we would now label with different mental health diagnoses. And Freud believed that many neurotic symptoms like phobias and compulsions, obsessions, anxiety, physical tics, and a host of maladaptive behaviors were symbolic manifestations of unresolved unconscious conflicts. And he argued that these symptoms were not caused by identifiable physical pathology, but by psycho-emotional processes, particularly repressed memories of painful or shameful experiences, often tied to sexuality. And to make the unconscious conscious, Freud experimented with techniques like hypnotism and free association, dream interpretation, and transference, which is the emotional projection of the patient onto the analyst. So free association asked patients to say whatever came to mind without censorship. And dream interpretation treated dreams as symbolic expressions of unconscious wishes. And transference was seen as revealing unconscious attachments and conflicts, which, once they arose, could then be discussed. And all these practices give rise to that classic image of the analytic scene, which everyone probably has in their mind. The patient lying on the couch, speaking freely about memories and fantasies in their inner life. And this became known as the talking cure, because the treatment was simply conversation and not something physical.
We would like to connect with you to have engagement with our listeners to this podcast. And so if you have ideas for articles or things you'd like to see us cover on the Postmodern Realities podcast, or if you would like to hear one of our articles that doesn't already have audio for our Christian Research Journal Reads podcast, please do contact us at response@equip.org. That's the best way to give us your input, and we would be really grateful for it. Also, we're thankful for your partnership, as I say, every episode, and we would like to invite you to partner with us really by telling people about this podcast, and better yet, if you have a few moments of your time, I think the best way to leave us ratings, which you can leave us ratings and review anywhere, but it helps us most on Apple Podcasts if you could give us a rating or review, a written review that's a sentence about why you listen to podcasts, because in this high-tech world, We are also influenced by the algorithms, and the algorithms suggest things to us. And so we would love our podcast to be suggested to others, and you can help us out with that. So thank you for partnering with us, giving us your feedback, and being a faithful listener. We really appreciate it. And now back to my conversation with Elisa about Sigmund Freud. So it's really interesting. Sigmund Freud's, legacy, his reputation has come under some criticism in more recent decades. Someone else too I'm thinking of is Margaret Sanger. And that's, prior to that, he's enjoyed a long period of respect. And like you've been talking about, just all of the different ways in which psychoanalysis has just impacted us culturally now. So can you tell us what was revealed about him and his work, and how has his legacy faced some accusations of plagiarism and medical fraud, pseudoscience? You were just talking about just his drug addiction, or sounds like his use of drugs. So that's kind of fascinating. So what has some of these more recent discoveries, kind of shown a little bit a tarnish on his previous reputation?
Right. Well, for quite some time, Freud had a cult of personality built up around him, and his devotees engaged in a lot of reputation management for his sake. The psychoanalysts in his coterie, protected him primarily through the creation of the Freud archives, where all of his writings were kept, and anything that reflected on him unfavorably was kept from public view or was heavily edited and redacted. And Freud burned a lot of his own correspondence and even destroyed case history notes after publication so that no one could go back and compare the public and the private narratives. But thankfully, he didn't burn everything, and some of those sealed documents in the archive were open to the public in the 1980s, which caused quite the scandal. Freud's letters to his friend and colleague Wilhelm Fliess revealed what he actually believed and how his patients actually fared under his care. And these revelations kicked off the so-called Freud Wars. His supporters and his critics argued over whether Freud just made some false starts and gradually evolved and made understandable mistakes along the way, or whether he was actively engaged in cover-ups and public lies to preserve his reputation, and of course, the reputation of psychoanalysis, which was kind of his baby. I am personally convinced that Freud was both a very ambitious man and a morally weak man who was dishonest when it suited him to be. In Frederick Crews's book, Freud, The Making of an Illusion, he goes into extensive historical detail about the specific ways that Freud's dishonesty damaged people. As one example, he tried to treat the morphine addiction of one of his friends by prescribing cocaine. And as I'm sure you can guess, his friend wasn't cured, but became doubly addicted, and his already poor health was totally destroyed. But Freud, undaunted as always, went and published a paper claiming that he had cured his friend and that others should follow his treatment plan. And other people did, even though it didn't work. And Freud's most famous psychoanalytic cases with detailed published accounts, particularly Emma Epstein, Ida Bauer, Sergei Pankajeff, and Ernest Lancer, people can look up these names. All of these individuals suffered and worsened under Freud's treatment, but he claimed improvement and cures for them in widely read case studies that bolstered his psychoanalytic theories. Freud also routinely plagiarized the work of others and accused other people of stealing ideas from him. And scholars have found over 150 instances of disputed priority in his work. So this was a habit for him. But perhaps the largest criticism of Freud in recent years is against psychoanalysis itself. Freud claimed that it was indeed a science and that it was objective and testable and effective. But once more of Freud's documents came to light, many professional psychologists and sociologists were able to demonstrate that Freudian psychoanalysis isn't science, it's a pseudoscience, which is a belief system that mimics the trappings of scientific inquiry and speaks in a scientific idiom. But a pseudoscience isn't empirically grounded. It's immune to falsification, and it either ignores contrary evidence or assimilates evidence into pre-existing theories that function a lot more like unchangeable dogmas rather than scientific theories. And Freud generated theories based on tiny and unrepresentative sample sizes, sometimes on just a single person's experience, often himself. He would make sweeping generalizations about human nature based solely on intuition. So he was doing armchair philosophy, but he was doing it in a clinic with vulnerable patients. And Freud was also an avid Sherlock Holmes fan, and he styled himself in print as a savvy detective of the psyche, scouring the hidden realms of the unconscious and outwitting his patients and constructing diagnoses from their clues. And Freud was an excellent writer, but rhetorical skills aren't the same as scientific skills, like the ability to take criticism, to understand statistics, and to ground your practice in evidence. And if Freud's patients had the audacity to disagree with him, here is how he responded. And this is a direct quote: "We must not be led astray by initial denials. If we keep firmly to what we have inferred, we shall in the end conquer every resistance by emphasizing the unshakable nature of our convictions." And that's religious language of faith. That's not the language of science. And in one of his letters to Fleece, Freud wrote this about himself: "I am actually not at all a man of science, not an observer, not an experimenter, not a thinker. I am by temperament nothing but a conquistador, an adventurer, if you want it translated, with all the curiosity, daring, and tenacity characteristic of a man of this sort." So Freud indulged his curiosity about the human psyche at the direct expense of the people who thought they were his patients receiving what we would today call mental health care. But they were guinea pigs, and they didn't know it. Freud admitted near the end of his life that the only reasons to be a psychoanalyst were to investigate the unconscious and to earn a living. Actually, helping people was not what he was doing, and he knew it, and he still gladly took their money. And this is why his reputation has tanked in recent decades, for good reason.
Well, it's very fascinating. So, in your article, you refer to aspects of Freud's psychoanalytic theory that, while they're not scientific per se, and you just kind of talked about some of those issues in terms of like how he wasn't really even good at that, and that there was just a lot of issues with his collection of data. There are certain things that ring true in people's experience and have proved useful. I mean, you talked about in your introduction just how what we know today in modern therapy in terms of like childhood trauma and all these kinds of things, people find to be very true when they go get therapy. So what are some of those insights? And is it Freud himself? So should Sigmund Freud get credit for these things?
Yeah, there are three things that Freud did talk about a lot and make use of: the power of the unconscious, the divided psyche, and the talking cure. And these three aspects of Freud's approach, they were not unique to him. He didn't discover them, he didn't invent them, but he did like operationalize them in a way that was accessible to people within a modern scientific idiom. He took these really old ideas and he turned them into components of a clinical psychological treatment for mental illness, and that approach has become increasingly popular. Therapy is a booming industry today, and that wouldn't be the case if everything Freud did and said was wrong. He highlighted these things, and he was right to do so because people benefit from understanding them and experiencing them. So one of these key ideas is that of the unconscious, our non-rational inner depth that is rife with biological drives and which influences our actions and emotions, even though it remains hidden from us and outside of our conscious control. Freud's famous phrase was, "The ego is not master in its own house." And this insight appealed to people who felt genuinely helpless and unable to change. And Freud conceived of the unconscious as kind of a garbage dump of repressed memories and shameful fantasies full of lust and rage and selfishness and self hatred. But other thinkers theorized about the unconscious before Freud did. Genet and Nietzsche and Goethe all beat him to it. But Freud put this idea to work clinically, and knowledge of the unconscious didn't have the curative effects that Freud hoped it might, but he was one of the first to think about the unconscious as something that you could plumb for your own purposes with a professional to help you do it. Freud also put to work this idea of the divided psyche, which he saw as having three parts: the id, which contains non-moral biological drives for sex and aggression; the ego, which is the aspirationally moral decision maker, which aims at control; and the superego, which is the hypermoral voice of parents and society, which is often kind of cruel. And Freud saw the ego as a mediator between the noisy voice of embodied desire and the nagging voice of societal norms, and then the hard limits of reality. And even if people don't agree with Freud's particular description of these inner divisions, most of us recognize the fact of inner conflict. Plato wrote about it. I mean, so did St. Paul in Romans 7, when he said, "For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep on doing." And there are other places where Paul talks about the sinful nature and the conscience being at war with one another. Augustine's Confessions talks about this inner conflict. And of course, Martin Luther described his battles with his besetting sins and his hyperscrupulosity, which sounds a lot like the battle between the Freudian id and the superego to me. And then finally, there's this idea of psychoanalysis as the talking cure, which Freud utilized in a really particular way. He wanted patients to talk about their symptoms and their earliest, likely repressed memories, and to free associate from there in an effort to uncover unconscious contents. And understood in this narrow way, the talking cure was not particularly effective. But what was effective, and frankly, what has always been effective, is the broader and more humane idea that just talking about your problems with a person who will listen and who cares about you, whether it's a friend or a spouse or a counselor or a family member, that does a body good. And for 1,000 years, the Catholic Church practiced private one-on-one confession of secrets and sins to a priest who offered pastoral counsel. So this form of soul care is something that people have known for ages and have always practiced in a non-professional way through religious and social life until Freud professionalized it. He turned a relationship of care into a medical job. So to sum it up, we can't credit Freud for creating these ideas and practices that are genuinely useful to people. We can credit him with turning them into a cash cow in the name of science. So he plays an important role in the transition from a world that described the human condition in terms of sin and redemption into one that described the human condition in terms of diagnosis and health. And that means psychological suffering becomes medicalized and monetized rather than being the purview of religion and friendship. And it's not fair to imply that Freud somehow stole these insights and practices from religious and social life. It's truer to say that religious and social life were already severely weakened by the Victorian era. And so Freud and the other psychoanalysts stepped into the breach and tried to address a real need for soul care or psychological well-being that just wasn't being met anymore by the traditional means.
That's really interesting that you're talking about this. And I think we might have talked about it before when you were on the podcast, but when we look at scripture, there's so many ways in which Christians are commanded to walk alongside one another and do those one another in community things where these kinds of issues would come up, especially as people, we share in our sorrows and in our joys. And it's interesting because all of that has now really left the church in terms of in the West. I mean, not everywhere, but just the go-to when people have, trials or suffering is, hey, do you know the name of a good counselor? Instead of going into the church. Now, there are, I think we talked about this before in the podcast, that there's very legitimate reasons why people would need counseling for something that was truly traumatic that they went through, or there's a season of counseling. You talked about that for yourself as well. But a lot of times people's go-to is they wouldn't talk about it in a religious context or in the context of their church relationships, but rather would seek help outside. So I think that's very interesting. And that makes me want to ask you more about what was Freud's attitude towards religion in particular and religious people who practiced religion. You mentioned he was Jewish in his upbringing, or that's his ethnic background. And was he ever in a religious family at all? Or what was his thoughts about how religion would address some of these issues?
Yeah. So Freud himself was an atheist, and he had a very low view of religious faith. He was ethnically Jewish and had been raised in Jewish traditions by his father, and he'd read the Torah, but their family was never theologically rigorous, only culturally Jewish. And Freud spurned not only the inner faith component of Judaism, but also the outward customs of his elders. He was raised in Vienna, which was predominantly Catholic and unfortunately very anti-Semitic. So it wouldn't be surprising at all if part of Freud's rejection of religion was connected to his desire to reduce the anti-Jewish prejudice that he suffered from and which did slow the progress of his career. Like Orthodox Jewish customs and rituals attracted mockery from Austrian Catholics. And one of Freud's keenest memories was of his father being bullied for being Jewish. And his father didn't fight back, he just passively put up with it. And Freud was deeply disturbed by his father's lack of resistance. So, for an ambitious young man like Freud, it's easy to see how attractive it would be to jettison any religious and cultural traditions that make you stick out like a sore thumb and attract negative attention, especially if you have no personal resonance with them from the get go. Frederick Crews actually theorized that this is a primary reason Freud aimed to both explain religion away with psychoanalysis and to replace religion with psychoanalysis. Crews sees the grandiosity of Freud's dreams for psychoanalysis as a theory of everything being rooted in his flight from the pervasive anti-Semitism of that era. So Freud did try to explain religion in psychoanalytic terms. He basically saw belief as a failure to mature. He thought religion was a weak-minded wish impulse that seeks protection and happiness in the childish fantasy of a heavenly father God modeled after your earthly father. And he thought that people who had matured would be strong enough to face the existential loneliness of the universe without the security blanket of religion, basically. Freud wrote, "Religion is an attempt to master the sensory world in which we are situated by means of the wished world, which we have developed within us as a result of biological and psychological necessities. But religion cannot achieve this. Its doctrines bear the imprint of the times in which they arose, the ignorant times of the childhood of humanity. Its consolations deserve no trust." But Freud didn't see religion as merely a matter of immaturity. He also saw religious belief and practice as a neurosis, as a psychological disorder in itself. Many of his patients were stuck in compulsive ritualized behaviors that aimed at controlling the uncontrollable, and Freud framed religious rituals as just private obsessions writ large, like neurotic compulsions people enact to alleviate guilt and anxiety and temptation and to avoid divine punishment. So, what Christians understood to be sacraments that create communion with God and with each other, Freud saw as clinical symptoms. To him, religion is the way folks express their sickness. It's not the way they get better. And it's worth pointing out here, by contrast, that Freud's protege, Carl Jung, who was also a psychoanalyst, believed exactly the opposite on this very point. Jung said that it is not the presence of religion, which is a symptom of neurosis, but its absence. And this is one reason, among many, why I'm a bigger fan of Carl Jung than of Sigmund Freud, because Jung recognizes the necessity of religious faith for psychological well-being. Jung even admitted that his healthiest patients were people with a strong religious faith that they participated in, and that religious symbols brought healing to people. But to Freud, that's garbage. That's nonsense. So on the one hand, while Freud believed that religion is for babies, he simultaneously felt free to wildly speculate about the origins of religion, and he does that in his book Totem and Taboo. He reconstructs a psychogenetic history of religion in which a primal horde of sons supposedly ganged up against their patriarchal father and murdered him to get access to all the women he'd been keeping for himself. And the guilt and grief over this patricide was supposedly transmuted into ancestor worship and communal rituals of eating a sacrificed animal, which represents the murdered father, of course. And this sense of original guilt is supposedly inherited over millennia by all people. And so Freud tries to kill two birds with one stone here. He's casting both the sacrifices of the Jews in the Torah and the Christian Eucharist as sick hangovers from a primal family murder. He's trying to use psychoanalytic theory to reduce religion to something disgusting and heinous by providing an alternate story of the fall. He basically wrote a new religious myth to replace Genesis. And his speculations have been thoroughly discredited by people who actually study in the fields that he was dabbling in when he wrote the book. But, this didn't trouble him. He retained his faith in his theories to the end.
Very interesting. So, what about his hopes for when he treated his patients psychoanalytically? You did mention earlier that he was kind of disgusted or frustrated with some of his patients. So what is the exact, ideal outcome? Do people get cured through psychoanalysis? And just like we were talking about a few minutes ago before you talked about his views of religion as an atheist, how does his views differ from what a Christian and, scriptural based conception of what good spiritual moral well-being should be, in contrast to a Freudian one.
Mm-hmm. Well, Freud believed that the best that one could hope for in this life is to reach a shrewd compromise with the human condition that reduces neurotic symptoms and boosts your sense of well-being. So, as I touched on earlier, Freud thought that the ego had to constantly negotiate between the lusty demands of the id and the guilt tripping of the superego and the limits imposed by external reality to find a livable compromise. And this compromise isn't salvific, it's not morally transformative, and it's barely even therapeutic. Like I mentioned earlier, Freud does not have a good track record of his treatments bearing long term fruit in people's lives. So, analysis is simply informative. It provides patients with more choices in life without dictating what the content of those choices should be. So, the analyst is trying to increase the patient's personal power while remaining morally neutral about ends. And this means that psychoanalysis is about technique and not about virtue. It's about consciousness raising, not about transformation. So, just as psychoanalysis tries to degrade the value of religious faith, it also robs us of the possibility of moral greatness. If the traditional Christian perspective has an inner hierarchy, you have desires that are better and desires that are worse. You can order your loves. You can sift the internal wheat from the chaff. You can recognize good and evil and choose one over the other within yourself, right? And all of that implies moral depth and moral possibility, both for improvement and for failure. But the psychoanalytic approach democratizes our desires, and it teaches us to tolerate our unresolvable contradictions and to live within the tension of morally equivalent and opposing desires that jostle for ascendancy. So Freud simply wasn't interested in goodness. He didn't imagine what the good society would look like or what the good life would look like. He was interested in healthy versus sick and in conscious versus unconscious, but he was not interested in sinner versus saint. He changes the categories and the language on us so that moral talk sounds kind of out of place in the analyst's office. Any kind of extended moral reflection would just sound like the shrill nagging of the superego. There's nothing transcendent or transformative about it. It sounds repressive and shame-inducing. And so it's really ironic that, what is typically called depth psychology would end up making us morally shallow. And this comes directly from Freud's rejection of religion as neurotic and childish. By banning transcendence from the analyst's room, you cut off the objective foundation of all moral judgment and the hope of all moral change, and you land straight where Freud wants you, in analysis, paying for something your ancestors had for free, and even then, it doesn't deliver. And so the Christian conception of spiritual and moral well-being is union with Christ. It's receiving and giving the love of God. It's being further transformed into his image. And in the Christian understanding, there simply is no well-being apart from God. So any form of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy that is expressly trying to replace religion is substituting scientific solutioning for a divine relationship. And if I had to draw a picture of that, it would look like Eve reaching for the apple, like trying to become wise and powerful on her own apart from communion with God.
So one of the things that people have heard about, probably whether or not they studied the work of Sigmund Freud, is the idea that he's well known for, which is the Oedipus complex. And maybe people don't remember who Oedipus is. So can you explain the theory and why he came up with it and how he came up with it?
Yeah. So in the early years of his practice, Freud was seeing a lot of female patients who suffered from what they called at the time hysteria. And he found a surprising number of them reported memories of sexual abuse by male family members. And he initially took these testimonies at face value, and he theorized that experiences of past sexual trauma, which had been repressed, could generate present-day hysteria. And he called this the seduction theory, which is kind of an unfortunate name. It doesn't convey what it should. A better name would have been the molestation theory. But over time, for unclear reasons, Freud changed his mind about these reports of childhood incest. He decided that what was more likely was that these women had merely fantasized about being raped by relatives and that they had repressed these shameful desires. So Freud's abandonment of the seduction theory led directly to its replacement by what he called the Oedipus complex, a theory which served his purposes in this case, reframing unwanted sexual assault as a wanted incestuous relationship, and it also fit directly with his own experience. Freud wrote in a letter to his friend Fleece, "A single idea of general value dawned on me. I have found in my own case, too, the phenomenon of being in love with my mother and jealous of my father, and I now consider it a universal event in early childhood." So, this theory enabled him to explain his own childhood experience, and it enabled him to absolve the upper class Jewish fathers of Vienna from the charge of incest and rape. And these men were the ones paying for their daughters and wives to get psychoanalyzed. And Freud was always sensitive about his bottom line. So, he did not want to rock the boat. And modern day feminists and other critics have taken him to task for this, since it seems likely that at least some of these women were sexual abuse survivors, and it kind of looks like Freud threw them under the bus. Although there is another possibility, and this is almost as bad, that Freud implanted the idea of childhood rape by hypnotic suggestion. And he admits that he might have accidentally done that in the early days when he was doing hypnosis on people. To Freud, the distinction between real incest and fantasized incest was minimal because both are shameful enough to trigger repression. So his theory treats them as functionally equivalent because it's repression that causes hysteria, not trauma itself. So for whatever reason, Freud trades the seduction theory for Oedipus. So, like you asked, what is the story of Oedipus? So the Oedipus complex is named after the Greek tragedy Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. And in the backstory of that tale, King Laius commits a terrible crime. He rapes a young boy that he's tutoring. And because of this sin, Laius is cursed by the gods, who say that his own son, Oedipus, will murder him. To avoid this fate, King Laius and his wife Jocasta expose their infant son, expecting he'll die. But he doesn't. He's adopted by strangers and grows up far away. And a prophet tells Oedipus that he is destined to kill his father and marry his mother. So to prevent this thing, Oedipus leaves home. But in a fateful turn of events, he ends up accidentally killing Laius without knowing it's his father. And when Oedipus saves the city of Thebes, he's rewarded by getting to marry the widowed Queen Jocasta, who is, of course, his mother, even though he doesn't know it. And the bulk of the play is the story of how Oedipus gradually uncovers, to his horror and shame, that by trying to avoid his terrible fate, he's actually caused it. It's really sad. And Freud's takeaway from Oedipus Rex actually inverts the story's meaning. Oedipus doesn't want to kill his father or sleep with his mother. Everyone in the myth acts to avoid murder and incest. The curse stems from Laius's crime, not from Oedipus's desires, making the tale about the sins of the father bringing ruin on the next generation. It's not about children's murderous, incestuous wishes. But Freud he misunderstands this story and he turns it into the shocking idea that every little boy wants to sleep with his mother and murder his father, and every little girl wants to sleep with her father and murder her mother. And Freud believed this complex only resolves when the little boy gives up his incestuous dreams of mother out of fear that his father will castrate him, or when the little girl gives up her desire for a penis, that's his theory of penis envy, and settles for the hope of having a baby instead, like her mother. And if all goes well, these violent incest fantasies are replaced by proper identification of the boy with his father and of the girl with her mother. And Freud saw these shameful sexual desires as just the kind of thing that our conscious mind would repress, which is why none of us remember having these secret fantasies. And critics have argued that the universalizing of his own incest fantasies is not a scientific discovery. Again, sample size of 1. But it's rather a self-serving projection and a way that he made his own twisted desires seem more normal, like a phase that everybody goes through.
Well, that's very interesting. And, you were saying earlier that this whole he had a view of sexuality that's really impacted us. So what was Freud's theory of sexual development, and what impact does it have on traditional conceptions of sexual morality? Because you said at the beginning, everything boiled down to him as some kind of sexual issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Freud made the Oedipus complex central to his theory of sexual development, but over time he added other components to it, especially in his work, 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality. He broadened the definition of sex in a way that let him break it down into its constituent parts, extending its presence prior to puberty. And these sexual components focus successively on what he called erogenous zones corresponding to age. So first there's the oral stage, which is age birth to 1, the anal stage from 1 to 3, the phallic stage from 3 to 6, the latent stage, which basically means not much is happening from ages 6 to puberty, and finally the genital stage, which is from puberty to death. And so, while most of us hear the word sex and sexuality and we assume it refers to male and female adults engaging in sexual intercourse, that is not what Freud means by sex. By taking the emphasis away from sex's conjugal meaning, which is its purpose, and focusing instead on the earliest time period when those pleasure zones in the body are activated, Freud sexualizes infancy. Children breastfeed, they get potty trained, they play with their genitals, they go through the Oedipus complex, and then finally at puberty, desire starts to get consolidated away from themselves and their parents and onto a possible mate. So Freud viewed heterosexual, marital, procreative sex as the mature pinnacle of development, something that hopefully, if all goes well, most people would achieve, but the path is treacherous, he thought. And by adopting this developmental framework, Freud could explain sexual deviations as something other than sins. Everything from masturbation, homosexuality, and fetishes to voyeurism, sadomasochism, and incest could now be understood as a psychological failure of development. It could be a quote-unquote perversion, which is what he called it, resulting from getting stuck at an earlier phase due to abuse or shame. Freud demolishes childhood innocence, replacing it with what he called polymorphous perversity. That was his choice term for infantile sexuality. He sexualized the fact that babies put everything in their mouths. He insisted on reading adult sexual perversion back into naive childhood embodiment. So for Freud, the question wasn't, why do some people become sexually deviant, but rather, how does anyone safely traverse the emotional minefield of childhood and adolescence to become sexually normal? His emphasis on sexual arousal as an appetite oriented towards certain body parts, rather than being the culmination of a relationship, makes sexuality a masturbatory experience. Like only under the right pressures and opportunities will desire be molded into something serviceable for society, which would be procreative marital fidelity. But Freud managed to make normal seem like an impossible achievement or like a matter of good luck. And he made sexual deviations seem really common, almost inevitable, like a spectrum of deviance, because we all have to pass through polymorphous perversity and the Oedipus complex, and none of us come through that unscathed. So Freud presented human sexuality as intrinsically disturbed. This is how Freud's vision of sexual libido, with its constant search for a pleasurable outlet, becomes this all-encompassing fact of life that shapes our personalities and relationships beginning at birth. So he spreads the surface area of sex over every single second of life. And he also used that hydraulic metaphor for sexual energy, or libido, as he called it. And this turned sexual desire away from being an interpersonal bond with the beloved into a biological drive to, let off steam or release the pressure, as if orgasm were a purely mechanical process and the particular means that one chose for release didn't really matter. And so Freud is correct that heterosexual, marital, procreative sex is what sex is meant to become. That is its ideal form, its telos. But I think because Freud's own personal experience of marital sex was ultimately disappointing and short-lived, he became disillusioned with that ideal. Freud and his wife Martha had 6 children in 8 years. And after that, once they hit their maximum of how many children they could handle, they stopped being intimate. And depending on whom you ask, a friend or a foe of Freud's, Freud lived out the remainder of his days either in prudish sexlessness, or he carried on an adulterous affair with his wife's sister Minna, who lived in the same house with them. And at one point, Freud wrote, "The cure for nervous illness arising from marriage would be marital unfaithfulness," which is basically a permission slip to have an affair as a form of therapeutic treatment. And that's about as self-serving as it gets. So one can't help but wonder just how much of his theories are elaborate self-justifications for his sins.
So I think there are people that assume that, what he was trying to do was loosen societal sexual mores, and that he is the person responsible for this whole sexual revolution, the idea that sex had to be liberated from repression, and just what you talked about, where he's disillusioned with the idea of marriage, and then that, people who are in that situation, they're being repressed, and so they need to be liberated. But you talk about in your article how his view is more complex than that. So what did Freud think about sexuality when it came to, public morality?
Hmm. Yeah, I had always thought that Freud stood clearly on the side of loosening sexual strictures and never on the side of, battening down the hatches. But that's not true. Because he had this hydraulic view of sexual desire where it can't be eliminated and it has to go somewhere, Freud thought the only options for a person with, quote unquote, non normative sexual desires are either one, fulfill them and risk being condemned as criminally perverse by a judgmental society, or two, unconsciously repress them and develop neuroses, which are the pathological leakage of unconscious libido seeking an outlet, or three, sublimate those desires through an incredible effort. And Freud believed that people could use that drive of libido to serve society through creative achievements like art, scientific investigation, and invention. But he also thought that sublimation was a high bar. Most folks aren't capable of that. And that's why society creates a lot more neurotics and criminals than artistic geniuses. But we collectively need our geniuses and creatives. So Freud wrote a book called Civilization and Its Discontents, where he argues that civilization runs on displaced libido. Without the tension of drives denied, we would still be living in huts, or we'd be in anarchy. He believed that for civilization to exist, we'd have to frustrate our desires. So he imagined that sexual repression and the sublimation of, quote unquote, the closet, where deviations are hidden from view, was simply the inside wall of that outward facing public reality called civilization. To abolish sexual limits would be to abolish society, full stop. And Freud knew that all of us would suffer, some more than others, through the necessary repression and sublimation of our sexual desires. He expected that most people would view sexual satisfaction as the greatest source of happiness in their lives, and that they would structure their lives around being sexually happy. But he knew that this would inevitably cause social disruption, and that society would stigmatize and punish people who sought their sexual happiness in a manner that wasn't family-oriented or future-oriented. Like, if you weren't going to seek sexual fulfillment in a marriage that produced children, then society was obligated, for the sake of its own self-preservation, to try to stop you. So Freud was very pessimistic about the prospect that anyone but a very lucky few would find lasting happiness in this life, including sexual fulfillment. And that's something that, when Freud is spoken about on a popular level, most people don't understand. Like, Freud expected you to be miserable and sexually unfulfilled. And he didn't advocate for the destigmatizing of deviant sexual behavior so that folks could pursue their pleasure. And that's not because he saw sexually deviant behavior as morally wrong or against the law of God, because he didn't believe in God. But he was a realist when it came to sex. He knew that there's a way to channel and sublimate sexual desires that literally builds the social world. And there's a way to liberate and dissipate sexual desires that literally destroys the social world. And for all of his shocking incestuous theories, he was still a buttoned up Victorian at the end of the day who appreciated law and order and stability. And so he saw the human condition as one of unsatisfied longing without change and without redemption. So continuous internal conflict between id, ego, and superego, and continuous external conflict between what you want and what society will let you have. That is your future. So Freud wasn't opposed to throwing the id a bone sometimes, to overlooking sexual sins here and there, but that's not the same thing as abolishing the closet. Like, when society demonizes certain forms of sexual expression for the sake of public order, that ends up shunting people with unacceptable desires into one of two miserable futures, as Freud saw it. If they act on their desires, they'll be labeled perverts and they might be put in jail. This is what happens to pedophiles and rapists. Or if people with unacceptable desires renounce them and repress them, then they'll inevitably become neurotic and they'll suffer. And they'll become like Freud's patients, in need of a professional to help you cope with your repressed sexuality. Freud saw what he called perverts and neurotics as two sides of the same coin of inappropriate desire. One says yes to it and harms the social order. The other says no to it and psychologically harms him or herself. Freud simply couldn't imagine a scenario where a person had unfulfilled and unexpressed sexual desires, but still experienced happiness and psychological well being. The idea of a happy virgin or a happy, faithfully married couple, they couldn't exist in Freud's universe. They're like unicorns, they're impossible fantasies. Freud couldn't conceive that sexual self control and personal happiness could coexist. He had an extremely narrow and hypersexualized view of happiness, and no conception of the Christian view that virtue and happiness are actually the same thing. Like he puts both virtue and happiness out of reach for the ordinary person. And it's no wonder that people don't know about this today. Nobody would want to hear it. And Freud wrote in one of his letters, I stand for an infinitely freer sexual life. But I'm confident that when he said infinitely, he was not imagining the situation that we have today. A global pornography industry that rakes in $97 billion a year. He wasn't imagining widespread hookup culture or sex trafficking or pride parades or gay marriage or Tinder. So it's a misuse of Freud's ideas to portray him as an advocate for society-wide sexual liberation. He basically just wanted husbands in sexless marriages to have permission to cheat. He wanted a carve out for his personal sins, but he wasn't looking to rubber stamp anybody else. And that makes him a hypocrite, but he's still a realist about the level of self-control and self-denial that it takes for us to create a social world that's worth living in and one that sustains itself.
That's fascinating because I think most people think that he himself would promote those things. And so, can you describe for us the ways in which his followers, after his death, repurposed his theories to promote some of these wider societal sexual liberation movements that you said that he himself wasn't championing at the time? But how did his followers take his ideas and promote them on a societal level?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what happens is that Freud's social realism and pessimism is jettisoned by a number of post-Freudians that take his ideas and meld them to Marxist ideas. The four people I discuss in the article are the psychoanalyst Wilhelm Reich, the philosopher Herbert Marcuse, the writer Norman Mailer, and the scholar Norman O. Brown. So Reich pastes a layer of Marxist revolutionary politics on top of the Freudian battle between the id and the superego. He connects the proletariat underclass with the sexual drive of the id, and he connects the ruling bourgeoisie with the superego's repressive demands, so that sexual liberation from one's own hyper-strict conscience becomes part of the same project as overthrowing our capitalist oppressors. Reich is the father of this idea that promiscuity is political activism, that free love is the best way to fight both neuroticism and fascism, because in his view, there's nothing more fascist than the family. And Marcuse acknowledged, along with Freud, that some degree of societal repression of sexual desire is necessary, but he believed that capitalist societies require a surplus of repression. And so Marcuse advocated for the use of technology to free up our desires. He wanted scientific progress to make it easier for us to be sexually fulfilled. So when Freud said, we've got to have sexual repression for the sake of civilization, Marcuse replies, well, that's only because of the problem of scarcity, which capitalism perpetuates. If we could technologically solve the scarcity problem that makes all of us work all day and waste our lives and dries up our instinctual life, then we could all be sexually fulfilled. So Freud had talked about the tension between the pleasure principle, which animates personal desire, and the reality principle, which is a recognition that you don't always get what you want. And so Marcuse is saying, let's use technology to change the reality principle, to make it so that reality isn't so harsh. It's a technological utopianism. And then there's Norman Mailer, who was writing during the time of the Beat Generation and the hippies. And he's the one who explicitly made the connection between sexual expression and mental health by saying that orgasm is a form of therapy, that it's better to live your life in pursuit of the most apocalyptic orgasm you can imagine than to spend hour upon hour on the analyst's couch trying to understand yourself or force yourself into the frame society expects of you. Mailer idealized the psychopath, the person who's completely self-absorbed and takes what he wants. He saw spontaneous sexual pleasure seeking as pure and natural and authentic, in contrast to society's rules. And he crafts this new hero narrative for the sexual rebel who sees the orgasm as both a sacrament and a form of therapy. And this made repression rather than license the greatest evil. And it solidified sex as something that belongs to the realm of science and therapeutic medicine rather than the realm of morals. And lastly, I wrote about the work of Norman Brown, and his biggest argument was that rather than repressing or changing our sexual desires, we should change reality to align with desire, because this is the only rational response to what he called the immortal strength of libido. So Brown wrote using a symbolic and mythical language about Dionysus and about the need for a return to a more instinctual, embodied life. And Brown wrote at the beginning of the counterculture, and his work was used as an intellectual justification for the sexual revolution. And if you take Brown's idea about changing reality to align with desire and combine it with Marcuse's idea that technology will usher in a world of fulfillment, then you've got a recipe for what started with the pill, but has since blossomed into the medical therapeutic industrial complex, that gives us everything from contraception to HIV treatment and prevention to IVF and surrogacy to abortion on demand and gender affirming care. And all of these technologies represent the medicalization and the monetization of our sexual lives in an effort to remove sex from the realm of morality. And each of these things represents the use of technique to change reality to align with desire, to save us from the moral effort of growing in virtue. And all of these things are attempts to eradicate the suffering that Freud told us we would have to endure. So just to sum it up, all these post-Freudian thinkers used Freud's thought to undermine the bitter realism of his thought. They countered Freud's pessimism with sexual utopianism fueled by technological advancement, all of which has proven to be very socially destructive, just like Freud thought it would be.
So your article critiques the popular Freudian notion that personal sexual fulfillment, is required for psychological well-being, and that repressing, quote unquote, repressing sexual desire makes a person neurotic. And you talked about he was treating women for hysteria. So why would you say that common view is misguided? Because I think we've talked about it before, but in our age of just the whole focus on identity, whether it's sexuality, which is a big part of it, but are other things, it seems that to be fulfilled, you have to be able to express your sexual desires. Otherwise, there's something completely wrong with you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the idea that sexual oppression makes you neurotic has a lot of purchase in our culture today. And in part, that's because the whole realm of mental health has just ballooned into the primary way we talk about ourselves and describe our problems. Like, way more people use therapeutic language in their daily vernacular than religious language or even moral language. And we've so thoroughly medicalized and psychologized ourselves that it's almost impossible to talk about yourself without entering mental health territory. And for a lot of people, especially for non-Christians, mental health has functionally replaced faith in God and the pursuit of the moral life. I mean, who aspires to be a saint today? No one talks like that. Most folks are thinking, I'd like to be less anxious. I want to maintain my boundaries. I'm trying to discover my true self. I should probably go to therapy because I'm unhappy and maybe they can give me some medication. Like, that's the world of psychological man. And in that framework, which lacks any kind of intrusion of the transcendent and which sees happiness as a purely immanent thing, then the warning that sexual repression will lead to bad mental health outcomes, that'll function like a fire and brimstone sermon used to function. Like, you don't want to do anything that would jeopardize your mental health. And plenty of things that used to be seen as sinful are justifiable now in the name of mental health. Adultery, divorce, abortion, estrangement, promiscuity, banning speech, banning books. I mean, the list goes on. So Freud provides people today with a therapeutic sounding justification for sexual selfishness. Do it for your mental health. It's better to be a fulfilled libertine than a virtuous neurotic. And I think Christians need to push back on that assumption that sexual self-control leads to mental illness. In the article, I refer to research studies that demonstrate that the lack of sex in a person's life isn't a harbinger of neurosis. Self-chosen abstinence and celibacy don't pose any mental health risks to individuals. Granted, it's really hard to be in a position where you want to be married and you want to enjoy sex that is, like I framed it earlier, in service to the future rather than in service to yourself, but to not be able to find a spouse. That is a really painful form of suffering. But we need to be precise here. Suffering because you long for something good and it hasn't arrived yet, and in that waiting and hoping you continue to follow your conscience, that's what St. Peter calls suffering for doing good. It is not the same thing as being neurotic. We are capable in Christ of bearing suffering with dignity without needing to stick a diagnostic label on it. And a person undergoing that difficulty is not mentally ill. They're choosing a dignified moral stance that is difficult, but that is oriented beyond the immediacy of this life. So, just to reiterate, we can experience well being without sex, just not without love and friendship. And psychological well being doesn't imply or demand an absence of suffering. So, what is actually risky for people psychologically is not the absence of sex, but it's relational loneliness. It's a lack of affectionate touch and emotional connection. So, people need the love of friends and family. They need hugs and affectionate touch. They need relationships of commitment in which they can give and receive care. And all of that is possible without bringing sex into the picture. Like, we can fulfill our human nature without engaging in sexual activity, but we can't fulfill our human nature without engaging in social connection. And the one unique case in which sexual activity is crucial to mental health and well-being is between married couples, because that is the one relationship that sex is actually designed for. That's what sets marriage apart from every other kind of human bond. It's the one place where sexual intimacy, fidelity, and baby making are supposed to happen. It's implied in the marriage vows. And so sexlessness in a marriage is clearly a cause of psychological distress, and it can make people, neurotic in Freud's terms, and it does need some form of healing and restoration. A marriage without sex, as long as the physical capacity for it is there, isn't functioning like a marriage. It's broken in some way and needs help because sex is intrinsic to marriage. But when people today talk about sexual liberation as a component of mental health, they are not thinking about renewing sexless marriages. They're probably looking for a justification to get a divorce and to hook up with someone new. So our culture glorifies sex more than it should, and it makes it central to identity, which makes strained marriages even more fragile, because folks start thinking, well, I'm not getting any at home, so I should be able to get some elsewhere. I'm entitled to it, or else I might get depressed. And our culture also makes marriage and family and long-term friendships harder to maintain, often because of the constraints and incentives that higher education and economic necessity can create for people. So more and more people live alone and suffer from loneliness and often have poor mental health like anxiety and depression because they are genuinely alone. And the idea that more orgasms are going to address that pain is laughable to me.
Well, I want to ask you finally to wrap up our conversation just to compare and contrast the difference between a Christian moral vision and a biblical vision for sexuality, and you started touching on it in your last few comments, and what Freud offers.
Mm-hmm. So Freud's writings on sex lack an understanding of genuine embodied love. And like I mentioned earlier, given his personal experience of disappointing marital sex, this is perhaps not surprising. But even when he speaks of, superego approved, mature marital sexuality, it comes across really coldly as mere copulation centered on body parts, as if they were instruments for pleasure, rather than seeing the body as the incarnation of a beloved person. And Freud's descriptions of sex are never personal. Sex is hydraulic, tool-like, phallic-centered, disenchanted, lonely, shameful, and contaminated with infantile fantasies. To me, Freudian sex always sounds masturbatory and pornographic. It's instrumentalized, disenchanted, and objectified. I think just about anybody would be better served by reading the erotic poetry of Song of Solomon than by reading Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. Because what the poetics of biblical sexual intimacy reveals to us is the whole, the telos, the fruitful, faithful, and pleasurable union of lover and beloved, which is more than the sum of its parts because it creates a bond and it literally creates the future through the children it brings into the world. And it also serves as the best symbol we have for the relationship of God to his people, whether that's Israel and Yahweh in the Old Testament or Christ and his church in the New. So the Christian perspective on sex, by virtue of its being elevated into this divine symbol, is always glowing with dignity and beauty that the Freudian perspective, precisely because of its atheism, has no access to. And without anything transcendent to orient sexuality beyond the rather dreary injunction to just keep adding new little citizens to the society that represses you, sex becomes something furtive and shameful and even enslaving. And Freud's belief that sexual repression makes us neurotic is an either or framing that makes three false assumptions. First, it assumes that sexual desire is unchanging. And second, it assumes that humans are simply no match for it. And third, it assumes that by simply removing the category of sin and the practice of stigma, we'll be able to avoid moral injury. As Christians, we need to critique Freud's view that man is utterly at the mercy of his sexual instincts. That might be true if humans were merely sophisticated animals and if this world was merely material. Like, absent any transcendent order, Freud would be right. But humans aren't just bodies. We're embodied souls made in God's image. And this world isn't just matter, it's God's creation. And that means humans don't just have sexual instincts. We also have moral instincts and we have spiritual instincts. And the world is suffused with the grace of God, and that means human freedom is always a possibility. Freud said the ego isn't master in his own house, but Christianity begs to differ. And I love the words of Pope John Paul II on this topic. He says it so well, so I'm going to quote him. Certainly mankind is marked by concupiscence, lust, and if one was guided solely by the forces of nature, one could not avoid its influence. But the main difference between the vision of Freud and that of the Church is that Christ did not leave us entrapped by this influence. Man is not a being continually at the mercy of concupiscence as the Freudian libido would have it. He is called to the supreme value of love in the truth of his body. And I love that language of being called to the supreme value of love in the truth of the body. And depending on your circumstances and marital status, that might mean you're called to express chastity as the way of valuing love in the truth of your body. Or it might mean marital intimacy as the way of doing that. But in neither case is the goal self-expression or mental health. And in all cases, the power of Christ frees us from slavery to immediate fulfillment of our sexual appetites. In Christ, I can realize that I am not synonymous with my desires. Like, my desire isn't my identity, and I'm responsible for desiring better desires. And that kind of moral transformation is possible, and I'm willing to work at it in cooperation with grace. And God grants me the agency to become the master in my own house. And so this is the rebuke we need to offer to Freud's pessimism. As Christians, we're a hopeful people, who believe in redemption and forgiveness. We believe that by the power of the Holy Spirit, our desires, even sexual ones, can become malleable to influence, and that they can gradually take on a new and more virtuous shape over time. And we know that freedom isn't the ability to do whatever you want, but the ability to say no to an unworthy desire. We know that God's love is morally transformative. We know that when reality objects to our desires, God provides grace to transform them into something better, as well as grace to help us suffer bravely when our desires remain both unchanged and unfulfilled. And that might happen. But as Christians, we're uniquely equipped to bear with suffering that we can't take away. And that includes the suffering of bearing up under the pressure of an inappropriate sexual desire that won't fade, no matter what we've tried, and that our conscience won't let us fulfill. And so this is where I'm still inclined, to tip my hat to Freud's reality principle, that life is hard, that suffering is inevitable, and that both God and society make demands on us that are hard to fulfill, and that we aren't promised individual happiness in this earthly life. It is hard to be human, full stop. But we are promised eternal joy and communion, and we're promised the divine reality of which sexual intimacy is just the pale symbol.
Well, that is a lot of things to think about. And also, we will link in the show notes Elisa's previous article on trauma and counseling. And on a very much lighter note, it is January. I know a lot of people don't necessarily make resolutions, but do you have any resolutions, or what about goals? Do you have any goals for 2026 that you hope at the end of the year that you were able to work toward?
Yeah, I do have a goal. I'm trying to write my first book. So I really hope I complete that goal.
That would be a good goal. Well, thank you for being a guest again on the Postmodern Realities podcast.
Thanks so much, Melanie.
You've been listening to episode 482 of the Christian Research Journal Reads podcast. Today's guest was Elisa Riddell, and she has written a feature article in the Philosopher series for the Christian Research Journal, and her article is called Sigmund Freud and the Making of Our Modern Sexual Identity. You can read this article for free online at equip.org. You won't want to miss out on subscribing to the other podcasts from the Christian Research Institute. We have the Bible Answer Man podcast, which is published Monday through Friday with the best of the week on Saturday. It's hosted by CRI President Hank Hanegraaff and is available wherever you get your favorite podcasts. In addition, Hank has a podcast called Hank Unplugged. Hank takes you out of the studio and into his study to engage in free-flowing, essential Christian conversations on critical issues with some of the most interesting, informative, and inspirational people on the planet. And you won't want to miss out on the brand new podcast from the Christian Research Journal. Christian Research Journal Reads presents audio versions of Christian Research Journal articles. It was a print incarnation of almost 45 years. It's now on the web, as you know, with new articles every single week. So you won't want to miss these audio articles of some of our most popular and most accessed articles on our website, equip.org.